other big groups other than
so
CIA?
as long as that existed like that, the Navy and the Air Force the Navy and the Army had input.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So any national military establishment.
Yeah, in 1949, Sidney Shallot, at the behest of General Vandenberg, wrote a 2-part article for the Saturday Evening Review.
Vandenberg. How does that sound? Vandenberg. Oh, Vandenberg.
He is later to become the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. So he was friends with Sidney Shallot. Sidney Shallot wrote a lot of articles favorable to the Air Force, and one of the things that Vandenberg wanted him to do was to write an article on UFOs for the Saturday Evening Post.
Oh, so they're going public with their findings now.
Yeah, back in the 40s. Shallot wanted to do it in 48, but Vandenberg kept putting him off. So in 49, he said, "Do this." Yeah, but I'm going to explain how the Navy and the Army were involved here.
Okay.
So Shallot went out to Wright Field, where the UFO project was. But before they could do that, the Air Force asked the Navy and the Army if it was okay for Shallot to do this article and to see the material. So so you can see by this that the Air Force consulted with the Army and the Navy on this article before they could send Shallot out there. In other words, they asked for concurrence. Later on, I don't know exactly when, the Air Force gained prominence. They were the only ones. But in the early days, the Army and the Navy had input into the UFO project.
They were collaborators for the defense of the United States and apparently the world at the time, right after Korean War, right?
So the other services had input into what was going on, but finally the Air Force got primacy. They were the only ones.
Who authorized?
And so
that?
when they closed down the project, they said nobody else should pick it up.
You've got all the data on who authorized what. So was that from the president on down, or did? No.
This is the Air Force.
Just strictly the Air Force.
It's strictly the Air Force. The National Science Foundation got involved. It's recommendations. The National Science Foundation recommended that the Air Force's ideas be accepted. It wasn't,
when a lot of intelligence going into it. They weren't joint collaborating. It was just Air Force says, and this New York Post idea is going to be telling everybody how we're going to think together, I guess, with the public. Sounds like a railroad. Railroading, but okay. So you together.
The Saturday Evening Post article is very interesting. That Sidney Shallot, he said that was the worst experience he had with the U.S. government, was writing that UFO article. It's a 2-part article. It's in the Saturday Evening Post, and of course it was during Project Grudge, so it was very negative. And
back down there, the Saturday Evening Post was what's what, right? That was the cat's meow, or that was what.
Yeah, that was one of the big ones. It was I guess you might say it's number 3 or number 4. You go look. Life, then look.
Yeah, it's no longer around, but it was at one time one of the.
It was up there in one of. And remember, people didn't have televisions then.
Right, we actually read magazines to know things.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, so magazines and newspapers were important then, more important than they are now. I'm not saying that they're not important now, but they were more important. And even when television came in, they were still important. But you don't find Life magazine anymore. It went out of business.
The Saturday Evening Post is gone.
Yeah, and so you still got Time. You don't have Newsweek anymore. So a lot of magazines are gone. But at the time, it was a pretty good media.
So as a historian,
a lot of millions of people subscribe to these magazines. So
you see the importance of the government wanting to use that as a platform to say this is how it's going to be, folks, and let it just go from here, huh?
Well, let's not go with it. Let's not go right there. Let's not go there at all.
Okay.
It's General Vandenberg and a guy named Mr. Leo, who is the head of information, Pentagon information. These two guys are the guys that get with Sidney Shallot and say, "Hey, we think you should write an article on this." And it's mostly Vandenberg's idea, and Mr. Leo is constantly needling Vandenberg. He said, "When are we going to do this article? When are we going to do this article?" Vandenberg said, "Well, I got a few other things for Sidney Shallot, but we're going to get to it."
Okay.
So finally, in 1949, he said, "Okay, Sidney, we think it's time for you to write this article." So Vandenberg is the main, and this is all in his diaries. You can find this in his diary, Vandenberg's desk diary, because it tells he had numerous meetings with Mr. Leo and Sidney Shallot, and then a lot of meetings just with Sidney Shallot by himself, and the items discussed are there, and some of the discussion is there. So this is all in General Vandenberg's diary.
Okay, so you have a copy of General Vandenberg's diary, or do we?
No, I do not. I have. I went to the Library of Congress and looked at the diary.
Wow.
And I made because it's not like a book. It's every day all the things that he did are in this diary. Okay, so at 9 o'clock he meets with General Twining, and 10 o'clock he meets with General LeMay, and 11 o'clock he meets with Hillenkotter, the chief of the CIA, and 12 o'clock he goes to lunch with some of his staff. So that's the kind of thing that's in his diary. And every day it's the what happened those days, what he was doing at that time.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That sounds pretty important, and
it is. And people went and looked at 1947 because at the time, Roswell was the big thing. That's the only thing if you were a ufologist, that's the only thing you should be interested in. And there was a hoaxed disc that happened in Texas, and people went and looked in 1947 in the diary, and they found that entry, and that's the only thing they looked at. So they didn't look at further along what happened with. There's not, General Vandenberg was not much. He didn't do much about UFOs except with Sidney Shallot, and that's in there. And there's a number of things when he was involved with Sidney Shallot, and that took going through, turning page after page after page after page.
A lot of pages.
Now, people wrote General Vandenberg about UFOs. Mostly it was civilians, reporting UFOs, and of course those things. There was a log of what kind of letters came in. It wasn't complete, unfortunately, but like I said, people wrote to him. People in the public wrote to him about UFOs, about seeing them and everything. And of course, they were just the letters were just sent to right field. So
you're
he didn't answer those.
As the standard or gold weight in ufology for Roswell set the benchmark, I get, because we had Foo Fighters and orbs and all of that prior.
No. The whole thing with Project 47 was to stay away from Roswell.
Oh, okay.
When I proposed Project 47, at that time, if you talked about UFOs, 90% of the talk was Roswell. Roswell. And I said, listen, 1947 was a giant UFO wave. It's the beginning of the UFO era. I said, Ted Blocher had looked at this, and it was a giant UFO wave, and I want to investigate the wave further. And my fellow colleagues told me, Blocher did all the investigation that's necessary. It's not important. Everything's been done, and I had to show them that there's still plenty of work to be done on 1947. And I said specifically when I started Project 47, I said, we're not going to look at Roswell. We're going to look at everything but that. If I find something about Roswell that's new, I'll let you know about it. On my website, there is some stuff that's maybe not new, but it's some of the things that I did find, and some of the things that should be looked for, which almost no Roswell investigator has ever looked where I suggested they look.
Well, Jan, let's discuss 47 to 74, but when did you, as Jan Aldrich, become a ufologist on the record? Is this in uniform in the Army or out of uniform after you get out of the Army and leave the post office?
No, I read Ruppelt's book.
At what age?
Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. I don't know. I think in 1957.
Oh my! So you're my age.
Yeah, when I was in junior high. So it made me curious. So I started reading other books.
Okay, so you were bound by something else. So Edward Ruppelt, born 23 to 60, a U.S. Air Force. Now, tell people what you're talking about with Edward J. Ruppelt, because
Well,
that
he was
changed your reality.